Okay, so you want to understand the American Civil War. You have probably heard the story 100 times. The righteous North versus the slave-holding South. A moral crusade. Brother against brother. 4 years of brutal fighting, and then freedom. You think about the battles. Gettysburg, Antietam, Chancellorsville. Very few people think about the Cotton Ledger. Here is the number that puts all of it in perspective. By 1860, enslaved people represented the single largest asset class in the United States economy, worth approximately $3.5 billion, more than the combined value of every railroad, every factory, and every bank in the country. That is not a footnote, that is the whole story compressed into one number. So here is the question nobody asks cleanly. How does a republic founded on liberty build its entire economic architecture on bondage? And what happens when that architecture becomes so profitable that dismantling it feels like financial suicide? The answer is not what most people expect, and once you understand it, you will see the Civil War not as a moral awakening but as a reckoning between two incompatible economic systems, both of which believed they were fighting for survival. It starts with a seed, specifically a cotton seed, and the machine that changed what it was worth. Before we can understand why the South seceded, we need to understand the economic engine that made secession feel rational. Before we understand the Civil War, we need to understand the economic dependency that created it. In the late 18th century, the American South was profitable, but not dominant. Tobacco had exhausted the soil of Virginia. Rice and indigo were regional commodities. Slavery existed, but the institution was expensive to maintain, and many founders, including slaveholders, assumed it would wither on its own within a generation or two. Then came 1793. Eli Whitney's cotton gin changed the calculation entirely. Before the gin, separating cotton fiber from its seeds by hand took one person an entire day to process a single pound of cotton. The gin, a simple rotating cylinder of wire teeth, could process 50 pounds in the same time. Overnight, the bottleneck in cotton production shifted from processing to picking, and picking required bodies, thousands of them. The timing was not coincidental. The Industrial Revolution was turning British textile mills into the most productive manufacturing operations in human history. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham were hungry for raw cotton on a scale the world had never seen. American southern planters had the climate to grow it. They had the land. They now had the technology to process it. What they needed was labor that would not demand wages. The result was a feedback loop of staggering power. More cotton demand from Britain meant more land under cultivation. More land meant more enslaved laborers. More enslaved laborers meant more cotton. By 1800, the United States was exporting 35 million pounds of cotton per year. By 1860, that figure had risen to 1.77 billion pounds, a 50-fold increase in 6 decades. Here is the early evidence of what this meant. In 1790, there were approximately 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million. The domestic slave trade, buying and selling human beings from the exhausted tobacco fields of Virginia and Maryland to the booming cotton fields of Mississippi and Alabama, had become one of the most lucrative businesses in America, generating an estimated $1.7 billion in revenue between 1820 and 1860. The South was not simply using slavery. It had built an entire civilization on it. Its credit system, its legal architecture, its social order, and its political identity. That was the structural implication. The cotton economy was not just profitable, it was total. And when a system becomes total, the people inside it stop being able to imagine life without it. But the profitability of cotton was only half the equation. The other half was what it cost the people who made it possible. Let's run the actual numbers, because they are almost impossible to comprehend at scale. Layer 1, the input cost. By the 1850s, the price of a prime field hand, the industry's term for a healthy adult male between 18 and 30, had risen to between $1,200 and $1,800 on the domestic slave market. Anchored to the purchasing power of an unskilled free laborer's daily wage, that is roughly $40,000 to $60,000 in today's terms. A large plantation requiring 100 enslaved workers represented a capital investment of $4 to $6 million in modern equivalent, before a single seed was planted. That capital was not dormant, it was collateralized. Southern planters borrowed against the value of their enslaved workforce to buy more land, purchase more laborers, and expand production. New Orleans became one of the financial capitals of the hemisphere precisely because it sat at the nexus of this system. Banks in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama issued bonds backed by enslaved people as collateral, bonds that were then sold to investors in New York, London, and Amsterdam. The financial system of the antebellum South was, in this sense, a leveraged bet on the perpetual expansion of slavery. Layer 2, the ongoing cost. Maintaining a large plantation operation meant clothing, housing, and feeding a workforce the planter legally owned. But the real ongoing cost was not material. It was political. The slaveholding class, fewer than 400,000 families who owned more than 20 enslaved people, dominated Southern state legislatures, congressional delegations, and, for much of the Republic's first 70 years, the presidency itself. 8 of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders. Maintaining that political dominance was expensive. It required controlling the narrative, suppressing dissent, and above all, managing the federal government's relationship with the question of slavery's expansion into new territories. Every new state admitted to the Union was a political battle over whether slavery could spread. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, each was a renegotiation of the same deal. And each renegotiation cost the South political capital it could not afford to keep spending. Layer 3. The hidden cost. Here is what the ledger never captured. The cotton economy's extraordinary productivity rested on a rate of coercion that required constant, brutal enforcement. A 2016 study by economists Edward Baptist and others found that cotton-picking productivity increased by roughly 400% between 1800 and 1860, not because of better seed varieties or improved technique, but because of systematic violence. The pace of picking was enforced by overseers with whips, and the baseline was set by the previous day's highest output. Slow down, and the consequences were immediate. That hidden cost was borne entirely by enslaved people. It does not appear in the plantation ledgers. It does not appear in the export statistics. But it was the foundation on which the entire structure rested. The total value of output produced by enslaved labor in the antebellum South, in modern purchasing power, has been estimated by economic historians at over $14 trillion. To put that in context, it exceeds the current annual GDP of China. The profits flowed north to merchants and financiers, to Britain, to Europe. The costs were paid by 4 million people who received nothing. Here is the insight most history books skip. The economic system was not fragile because it was immoral. It was fragile because it depended on a political arrangement that could not survive its own success. Here is the structural problem with the cotton economy's political architecture that nobody in Washington fully solved. The system required expansion, not as ambition, as arithmetic. Slavery was legal in the southern states, but cotton cultivation exhausted soil rapidly. A plantation that had produced peak yields in South Carolina in 1810 was already declining by 1830. The solution was always the same: move west, new land, fresh soil, more production. But westward expansion meant new territories, and new territories meant new states, and new states meant new votes in Congress. The South needed slavery to expand geographically to maintain its economic productivity. The North needed slavery to stop expanding to maintain its political power, and increasingly, its labor market. Free white workers in the North could not compete with unpaid labor. Every new slave state tilted the Senate against Northern economic interests. By the 1850s, the pressure had become visible. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, opening territories previously declared free to the possibility of slavery. What followed was not a debate. It was a war in miniature. May 21, 1856, Lawrence, Kansas. Pro-slavery forces sacked the town, destroying the offices of 2 anti-slavery newspapers and the home of the Free State governor. 2 days later, a man named John Brown led a retaliatory raid on a pro-slavery settlement along Pottawatomie Creek, killing 5 men with broadswords. The event was called Bleeding Kansas, and it was not an anomaly. It was the structural flaw becoming impossible to ignore. The people bearing the cost of this political instability were not the planters. They were the settlers, the farmers, and ultimately the enslaved people who were dragged further west as the plantation frontier moved. The structural flaw, a system that required infinite territorial expansion to sustain itself in a nation with finite borders and competing political interests, had a human face. It wore the face of everyone living inside the system's machinery. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of November 1860, without carrying a single Southern state, the slaveholding class understood what it meant. Not that Lincoln would abolish slavery where it existed. He repeatedly said he would not, and legally could not. But that the political architecture protecting slavery's expansion had cracked. The Senate balance was broken. The Supreme Court could be reshaped. The tariffs, the territories, the future, all of it was now in the hands of a party that drew its support entirely from the free states. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed within 6 weeks. They did not leave because of what Lincoln had done. They left because of what the numbers told them was coming. The bill had been deferred as long as it could be. What came next was not a surprise. It was arithmetic. The Confederacy entered the war holding what its leaders believed was an unbeatable economic card: cotton. They were wrong. And the miscalculation cost them everything. First consequence: King Cotton diplomacy fails. Confederate strategy assumed that Britain and France would intervene militarily to protect their textile supply. Secretary of State Judah Benjamin and Confederate President Jefferson Davis essentially held cotton hostage, restricting exports early in the war to pressure European powers into recognition. The strategy collapsed for 2 reasons. First, Britain had built up enormous cotton stockpiles in the years before the war. Second, the British working class, which voted, and which had a visceral opposition to slavery, made it politically impossible for Parliament to side with the Confederacy. The Lancashire mill workers who were unemployed because of the cotton shortage held public meetings declaring their solidarity with the Union. British intervention never came. Second consequence: Confederate finance implodes. Without foreign recognition, and with Union naval blockades cutting off export revenue, the Confederacy attempted to finance a modern industrial war with an agricultural economy. It printed money. By 1864, Confederate inflation had reached 9,000%. A pair of shoes cost $800 in Confederate dollars. A barrel of flour cost $1,500. Soldiers' families in Richmond were starving while government warehouses held food that no one could afford to buy. A woman named Mary Jackson led a bread riot through the streets of Richmond in April 1863. 300 women armed with hatchets and pistols, seizing food from shops and government wagons. Jefferson Davis appeared before the crowd and threw money at them. The money was nearly worthless. Third consequence: the long-tail damage. The South's physical infrastructure was devastated. Sherman's march alone destroyed an estimated $100 million in property: railroads, warehouses, plantation houses, livestock. But the deeper damage was structural. The collapse of the slave-based plantation system did not produce a free labor market. It produced sharecropping, a system that bound formerly enslaved people and poor white farmers alike to cycles of debt and dependency that persisted well into the 20th century. Some historians have estimated that the per capita income of the American South did not return to its 1860 level until the 1950s. The human accounting is the number that matters most. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died in the Civil War, a figure that exceeds American military deaths in every other conflict combined through Vietnam. Among the formerly enslaved population, the immediate aftermath of freedom was chaos. No land distribution, no economic foundation, and the rapid dismantling of Reconstruction after 1877 that handed political control back to the former slaveholding class under a new legal architecture, Jim Crow. What replaced the collapsed system was the sharecropping economy in the South and the accelerated industrial capitalism of the North. A new financial order in which the federal government, for the first time, collected income taxes, chartered national banks, built transcontinental railroads, and issued a national currency. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 and the National Banking Act of 1863 created the financial infrastructure of